Welcome to the Healthy Shift Worker podcast. I'm your host, Audra Starkey. In this episode, I had the privilege of speaking with Dr James Muecke, an esteemed Australian eye surgeon, ophthalmologist and recipient of the 2020 Australian of the Year award. James began his medical career in Kenya, where he developed a deep passion for combating blindness, and upon returning to Australia, he dedicated himself to preventing blindness, becoming an eye surgeon and a tireless advocate for vision health. He also founded Vision Myanmar and Sight for All, both organisations committed to eradicating blindness globally. In 2020, James was honoured with the titles of South Australian and Australian of the Year. Fast forward to 2024, James has shifted his focus on advocating for individuals with metabolic dysfunction. He's raising public awareness about the dangers of refined foods, and this commitment has led him to join the Medical Advisory Panel for Defeat Diabetes. With type 2 diabetes now being the leading cause of blindness in Australia and beyond, James is dedicated to highlighting the preventability and reversibility of this condition through the elimination of refined and processed foods. Speaking with James was an absolute honour, and on a topic that is very close to my heart, that being type 2 diabetes and metabolic dysfunction, given their health conditions that are quite prevalent in many who work 24/7. Despite his remarkable contributions to humanity, he remains incredibly humble in his mission to help others achieve better health outcomes. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did recording it. Alrighty, welcome back everybody to today's podcast. And I'm just so happy to welcome on today's guest is James Muecke. So thank you so very much for joining me this morning, James.
It's a pleasure, Audra. Thanks for inviting me.
Wonderful. And it really is an honor to have you on. You've just done so many amazing things throughout your career, and I do certainly appreciate you taking the time to have this discussion with you this morning. And I guess it, it has a little bit of when we're talking about type 2 diabetes, it certainly very much comes from a little bit of a heart thing for me, because a lot of shift workers, I'm losing my voice already. A lot of shift workers tend to be prone to things like type 2 diabetes. And so for a plethora of different reasons, it's very multifactorial, the disrupted sleep and not eating so much. And there's a lot of things going on there, but I really want to talk a little bit about this connection that you're in regards to eye health. But let's go back in time a little bit. What got you interested in not only, I guess, becoming a medical doctor, but eyes? Was there always this interest in going down the path of eyes?
Okay, we're going right back now. So when I was a youngster, I knew I wanted to be a doctor, and I loved working with my hands. So being a surgeon really appealed, but I particularly loved fine work. I used to build models and do all sorts of things. So this idea of microsurgery kind of evolved in my high school years. So I worked actually really hard through high school to ultimately get into medicine, which I fortunately did. And then I worked very hard through medical school to get into a specialty training. But I think the really formative time for me was going to ophthalmology was something that I was interested in. I mean, there were three major forms of microsurgery. One was neurosurgery, one was microplastic surgery, and one was ophthalmology. And each of those appealed. But I was able to tick off during my internship the ones that I weren't so interested in, and that left me with ophthalmology. So I headed off actually at the end of my internship to Africa to work in a little rural hospital in central Kenya. And that was a fantastic year. I was getting a bit jaded during my internship because I was mainly encountering people that had diseases that were eminently self-inflicted, and smoking was a critical one back in the 80s. And I was also starting to see a poor diet to become problematic. And it was really just alleviating symptoms, prolonging life, these diseases that were entirely preventable. And I was getting quite disillusioned, and went off to Africa and had this amazing experience where I was encountering patients that didn't have primarily preventable diseases. They had diseases which were predominantly infectious, also a bit of trauma, I was able to operate, deliver babies, perform cesarean section. So really reinvigorated of medicine for me. So fortunately, just before I left to go to work in Kenya, I went to visit the head of the eye department in Adelaide and explained what I was going to do. And he was very enthusiastic about my experience. And during my time in Africa, he actually called me and said that he had a training job back in Adelaide for me. So I came back to do ophthalmology. But I had this, at the same time, I had this passion for working in poorer communities, which was driven by this experience in Africa. So the idea of using microsurgery to fight blindness, particularly cataract surgery, which is the leading cause of blindness in poorer countries, and in fact in the world. And that was really inspiring for me. So I came back with this great gusto, great enthusiasm to undertake my training in ophthalmology. Back in 1990, I came back and ultimately finished my training a few years after that, and then headed off to work in Jerusalem, which also cemented this passion for fighting blindness in poorer communities.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, interesting that you were talking about how in the poorer countries they don't have a lot of the Western diseases that we have, the chronic health complaints and so forth, and that you were sort of thinking about the dietary component even back then. So that was in the 80s, is that right?
Yeah, my internship was in 1990 I went off to Kenya. But back to that, we're talking 35 years ago. And I remember being at the hospital, a little hospital called Tumu Hospital in the foothills of the Aberdeen Mountains. And we had an ECG machine and a cardiogram for measuring the heart tracing. And it didn't have any paper, so I couldn't use it. But in fact, I didn't need to use it the entire year because that issue with chronic disease and heart disease, cardiovascular disease, virtually non-existent from my experience when I was during my time there. So we're talking 35 years later. And unfortunately, in poorer communities, we used to call them developing countries, but in low-income countries now, type 2 diabetes is absolutely on the rise.
So when was it, I guess, when you were starting to work in practice here in Australia, when did you start to put the two and two together that there's, with your patients, that there could be this dietary component going on in regards to the eyes? Because when we often think of the likes of type 2 diabetes, we think straight away, well, I used to anyway, somebody that's maybe, carrying a bit of extra weight. We don't put this connection with the eyes. How did that sort of start to manifest for you?
Well, loss of vision is actually the most feared complication of diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. And I've been dealing with diabetes and its blinding complications really my entire career, which is now 35 years.
Yeah. And
what I've noticed over the last 3 decades plus is the rise of number of patients I'm seeing and treating with vision-threatening eye disease due to their diabetes. But I always kind of saw my role as a guy at the end of the line treating these complications, not thinking it was my responsibility to have this chat to them about their diet and the drivers of type 2 diabetes, which is multifactorial, as you know, but diet is a huge driver. In fact, our poor diet is responsible for more disease and death than smoking, alcohol, and physical inactivity combined. That's from Simon Capel's work in the UK. But in 2000, I wanted to do a documentary about the experience of blindness. And I interviewed 10 people, 4 children who were born blind, and they were fascinating. 4 people who are slowly going blind at the end of their lives due to age-related macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of blindness in Australia and say virtually all high-income countries. But the 2 that had the most profound impact on me were the 2 that had suddenly lost vision in the middle of their life, in the prime of their life, and due to diabetes. And one story in particular really grabbed me. It was quite devastating. It was a guy that had developed type 2 diabetes at the age of 26. And then 24 years later, at the age of 50, he went to bed one evening with normal sight and woke up the next morning blind in both eyes. And his story was absolutely heart-wrenching. He talks about the last thing he saw before he went to sleep was his wife's beautiful face before he turned out the lights. And that was the last time he saw her. It gives me goosebumps just telling the story now. But it was such a powerful story that I thought, we really need to tell this story, to get this story out there. So Neil Hansel is his name. He's quite happy for me to use his name. He actually came onto the stage when I won Australian of the Year in 2020. But his story was so powerful that we created a TV commercial, which aired in late 2018 nationally on Channel 7. To raise awareness of this blinding risk of diabetes and the need for regular eye checks. So that was really when the journey started, and it's kind of evolved since then. You're probably aware that in 2019, I was fortunate enough to be awarded a South Australian of the Year. And I thought, well, okay, this is a great platform to raise awareness of this issue and to encourage people to have their eyes checked. I wasn't expecting to win, but I fortunately did win. And then as I was going on to the national award ceremony in January 2020, I thought, well, surely I have a bigger responsibility here. If I was to win Australia of the Year, and I certainly wasn't expecting at all to win Australia of the Year, then what is Australia's biggest health crisis? Well, it's type 2 diabetes. And so I thought this was the thing that I would start to try and get my head around a bit more deeply. And I started reading at that stage, and particularly influential book was a book by Jason Fung called The Diabetes Code, and learned by reading Jason's book that you can actually potentially reverse diabetes naturally using real food as medicine rather than medicate patients. And that really launched me into this amazing journey, which I've had for the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Dr. Jason Fung's work. I remember reading I think his first book was The Obesity Code. I think that was the first one. And yeah, that he sucked me in. So his work is extraordinary and amazing. And yeah, kudos to you for taking advantage of the opportunity to, while the spotlight's well and truly on you, to be able to talk about a topic. And also you're really, even though I know you're sort of on the sort of the wind down with your career perspective, but you're really doing yourself out of service by helping people to not develop these eye conditions, because you don't want them to sort of be coming in to see you, which is a marvelous thing.
Absolutely. I mean, as doctors, we're trained to medicate. In fact, until 2021, the very first sentence on Diabetes Australia Type 2 webpage was type 2 diabetes is a progressive disease. But it's clearly not a progressive disease. And what I've noticed, one of the major treatments, we can talk about how diabetes affects the sight, but one of the major treatments involves injecting an antibody into the vitreous cavity, into the jelly behind the eye, to try and reverse the effects of the blinding consequences of diabetes. But what I found with my patients is that just reversing their metabolic dysfunction with dietary change also allowed the reversal of the blinding complications at a bit more detail. But it was an extraordinary journey in 2020. I got up and made a speech. It was just after the bushfires, you'll remember, and I changed my speech to kind of incorporate the heroes of the bushfires and watered down a bit the speech that I was going to give about sugar and diabetes. And it was from there on, it was just this incredible journey that I've taken. And there's so many more layers to it that I've learned over the last few years. But in 2020, I was fortunate enough to be invited to be on the expert advisory group for the National Diabetes Strategy. And I was able to get remission of diabetes into that document for the first time ever. And really that's launched this amazing cascade of events. That was published in 2021. And once it was published, I started then having a chat to my patients, particularly the patients who had vision-threatening eye disease, particularly the patients I was treating with vision-threatening eye disease, saying, are you aware that your disease could potentially be reversed or put into remission, however you'd like to say it? Mm-hmm. And only one out of the first 100 I spoke to, and I've got a couple of hundred with vision-threatening eye disease that I'm actively treating. Of the first 100, probably one actually had any idea. So this is a conversation that's not being had with patients. It's an issue that most GPs are probably not aware of. So then I wrote back to the mutual GP and said, can we explore the opportunity to put our patients' patients type 2 diabetes into remission? And we're talking type 2 diabetes here, not type 1, of course.
Yeah.
And most of the GPs sadly ignored the letters, and I had to keep on writing to them to encourage them. But a few took it on board. And I worked with a local nutritionist who specialises in therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, low-carb, healthy fat, ketogenic diet, whatever you like to call it. And then I started to see these amazing results. And I remember the first guy coming back, his name was Bevan Bruce. He's a local real estate agent. Again, he's quite happy for me to use his name. And he came off his insulin. He'd been had type 2 diabetes, been on insulin for over 10 years. He came off his insulin pretty quickly. Then he came off all his medicines. He lost a bunch of weight. He said he's never felt better. And actually, he's also said he started to see better. And then I saw, so this was one of the most exciting experiences of my medical career, my 40-year medical career. Absolutely riveting. And I found this with a number of patients who took it on board and took it on board enthusiastically. Watching them reverse their diabetes was an astonishing thing. But at the same time, I was getting a better bite back, particularly from endocrinologists who felt that this was potentially putting their patients at risk. So I thought, well, okay, we've got this concern amongst endocrinologists, but we have this technique by using real food rather than medication to potentially reverse diabetes. Let's get the practitioners of this low-carb, healthy fat approach or this ketogenic approach together in a room with the endocrinologists who are concerned about the potential risks. And I did that in, when was that? That was probably mid-2022. And it was quite an unpleasant meeting. It was quite hostile. At the end, we had some positivity that came out of it. And we got the low-carb practitioners just chatting with the endocrinologists. The endocrinologists started sending a few of their patients to the low-carb practitioners and actually seeing some of their patients put their diabetes into remission. So what unfolded as a result of that was then the writing of guidelines, and it was written primarily by a low-carb GP in Adelaide, Lorraine Lawler-Smith, and an endocrinologist had some input, Dr. Steve Strengths, who was the recent president of the Australian Diabetes Society, the past president. And it took about a year to write these guidelines, but in early 2024, so earlier this year, they were published and they've now been endorsed by the Australian Diabetes Society, and they've now been endorsed by Diabetes Australia. So that's super exciting. Here are two bodies that were ultimately espousing a high carbohydrate dietary approach for people with type 2 diabetes, people who are ultimately carbohydrate intolerant. And so it's been a really exciting journey. And as a result of that, I met with the president of Dietitians Australia and said, look, it's now been endorsed by Diabetes Australia and the Australian Diabetes Society. It's time for you to take this on board. We now have to stop recommending high carbohydrates to people with carbohydrate intolerance, which is the majority of the Australian population. And so they've agreed, and we're in process of preparing a 10-module course on metabolic health, which will be delivered to Dietitians Australia, both undergraduates and postgraduates, and in the middle of this year. And we're currently going out to all the medical schools. We had a really positive discussion with Curtin Medical School yesterday in WA, embedding this metabolic course in their curriculum. I remember my son is in actually 6-year medicine, but back in 2nd-year medicine, he had the opportunity to do nutrition as an elective. So it wasn't even compulsory in our major medical school, many of the major medical schools in this country. So it's the biggest health crisis that we have is dietary related, and yet most of the medical schools in this country are not addressing it at a really significant level. And the final piece of the puzzle is actually getting GPs on board, because you can imagine if patients are taking this on, and we have now probably in the order of 2 million patients with type 2 diabetes, another several million with pre-diabetes, and majority of the population who are insulin resistant, so they're metabolically dysfunctional. So we need to have GPs on board with this, because particularly with patients with type 2 diabetes who might be medicated, there are risks potentially. And so we need GPs to be on board with this to understand it. So we're now going out to GP world. And we're doing that through Peter Bruckner's Defeat Diabetes platform, the medical student approach, and the dietitian's approach is through a body called the Australasian Metabolic Health Society. So it's starting to happen, and it's exciting, but there's a lot more to do. There's lots of other layers to this, as I mentioned.
It is an amazing, it's so exciting to see this shift happening, and you've certainly been playing a part of it, being in the position that you are to help, and kudos to you for arranging that meeting. I think it's hard, for a lot of us or anybody in any profession, I suppose, to realise that maybe, just maybe, some of the advice that we've been told to give is wrong. And it's a hard thing to swallow for a lot of people in different professions. We none of us want to come to a realization, oh my gosh, have I potentially been making my clients worse by this information? But at the end of the day, it is what it is. We just have to learn from it and always put that patient care at the forefront. And I think it's extremely empowering knowing by being able to tell people that you can actually reverse your type 2 diabetes through diet. And I was going to ask you about the nutrition component through medical school, because I've also heard that used to be just a matter of hours that you used to provide. And considering food is medicine, it's extraordinary, isn't it? So in regards to your son going through medical school, there's still no change yet?
Yes, so there was a group of us myself, Peter Bruckner from Defeat Diabetes, and Defeat Diabetes has just been incorporated into Diabetes Australia as an approach that is going to be offered to their members, which is fantastic.
Okay.
And there was also members of Australasian Metabolic Health Society at that meeting with the Dean of the Adelaide Medical School. And so we're just working through how we're going to work that into the curriculum at Adelaide Medical School. We've met with Sydney Uni, we've met with a number of other universities at this stage, and over the next few months or next few weeks, hopefully we'll meet with all the medical schools and be able to incorporate that into their curricula. Because once again, medical students need to understand that. And there are medical students who are about to go out into the big wide world and not be aware of this really important information.
Yeah.
And as you say, what we've been telling patients for the last 50 years is this: eat lots of cereals and grains, eat lots of carbohydrates. And quite often I'll say to my patients, this is going back in 2021 when I started having these discussions about diet, I said, can we talk about your diet? Oh, doc, I'm eating well, I have lots of cereals and grains, not much meat. I said, it's actually probably the reverse of that we need to be exploring. And in fact, I gave evidence to the parliamentary inquiry into diabetes late last year. And I said, one of my policy suggestions was you need to review the 2013 iteration of the Australian Dietary Guidelines, which recommends a high-carb eating approach. They do suggest that this guideline is only for healthy Australians, but when you realise that over 2/3 of Australian adults are overweight or obese and about a quarter of our kids, the majority of Australians are not healthy.
Yeah.
And you realise then that there was significant bias that crept into the creation of that document. I think that needs to be reviewed. The question needs to be asked, have they worked? Well, clearly they haven't, because of the epidemic of obesity and type 2 diabetes and metabolic dysfunction that we're seeing. Have they caused harm? Yes, they probably have caused harm, because they're being used by bodies such as the Royal Australian College of GPs to advise patients with type 2 diabetes. So they're recommending eat by the Australian Dietary Guidelines. Diabetes Australia, eat by the Australian Dietary Guidelines. But the Australian Dietary Guidelines hold no relevance for the prevention or management of type 2 diabetes.
Yeah. Extraordinary, isn't it? And I'm certainly super excited to see that there is this movement happening. It's certainly well overdue. A bit like the whole cholesterol thing. Although it's probably another topic of discussion. It's certainly exciting times for those in the medical establishment, and at the end of the day, though, it's the patients, the Australian public. I think it's been very much a monetary-driven reasoning as to why perhaps the guidelines have been a little bit skewed. But again, that's probably for another topic of discussion. So just getting back to the eyes, when someone does develop diabetes 1 and 2, how does that manifest into the eyes? What's actually going on there, mechanism-wise?
Yes, so hyperglycemia, so the high level of glucose in the blood, hyperfructosemia, the high level of fructose in the blood, damages a structure called the endothelial glycocalyx. Now that lines every capillary, arteriole and artery in the body. It's perhaps the largest tissue in the body. It covers up to 7,000 square meters. It's metabolically active, but it's also fragile, and it can be damaged by hyperglycemia. When we know that in patients with diabetes, the endothelial glycocalyx is about 50% of the thickness of its normal thickness. And when you have damage to the endothelial glycocalyx, you get leakiness, and you get leakiness of what is in essence sugary water. The glucose is dissolved in the bloodstream, and you get leakage of sugary water out into the tissues of the body. And you get this called glycation. You get the glucose binding with proteins of the body's both structural and molecular proteins, DNA proteins, and that causes damage to those proteins. So what happens at the macula, what we call the central vision area of the retina, what we call the macula, you get leakage of fluid into the tissues of the central vision area, causing macular edema, diabetic macular edema. It causes blurring and distortion of vision, and it is the most common cause of loss of vision in people with diabetes of both sorts. The other thing that can happen is you can get glycation of the red blood cell proteins, and that causes stiffening of the red blood cells, so they don't mold to be able to pass through the fine capillaries and arterioles of the retina. And that causes a hold-up, a blockage, and that in turn causes ischemia. And that's also compounded by other elements. But the ischemia then causes a lack of oxygen flow, damage to the tissues of the retina. And when you have an ischemic retina, the retina tries to heal itself, and it tries to heal itself by producing what are called new blood vessels, neovascularization or proliferative diabetic retinopathy. And these new blood vessels are fragile and they can bleed easily. And the bleeding happens in general into the vitreous cavity, and that can take away the vision, sometimes immediately, sometimes permanently, as in the case of Neil Hansel, I mentioned before, who went blind in both eyes. That's a very unusual outcome, to wake up blind and go blind in both eyes. Certainly, unfortunately, he wasn't having his regular eye checks, and there are reasons for that. His main priority was his family, and he was from a lower socioeconomic group and wasn't able to afford to have his eye checks, which is an indictment in itself. But that's fortunately very, very unusual. But the manifestation of that, most people, would be the sudden appearance of floaters in their eye on the setting of diabetes, and sometimes it can be quite a significant, let's say, red out or blackout of vision, as opposed to the macular edema, which causes more distortion and blurring of vision. So I think anyone who has diabetes should be having their eyes checked. If they have type 2, from day one that they're diagnosed, they should have their eyes checked. If there's no sign of retinal disease, probably every couple of years I'll get my patients back to have a check. In fact, I usually refer them back to the optometrist, the local optometrist, to check their eyes. When they develop, if they don't have vision-threatening disease, I would then want to see them myself on a yearly basis. If they do have vision-threatening disease, they may or may not need treatment, and depending on whether they need treatment or not, I might be watching the patient every 3 to 6 months. But as I mentioned before, the most common treatment these days, both for macular edema and the proliferative disease, involves injections into the eye of an antibody called antivascular endothelial growth factor, which actually, in diabetic macular edema, it slows down the leakage of fluid into the macula. With the new vessels, it actually slows down the growth of these new vessels. So it has this double barrel effect, which is very, very, very useful. The problem is they're not one-off treatments. Initially, you have monthly treatments in one or both eyes for 6 months. And then, depending on the response, if you have a reduction in the edema, you might go out to 6, 8, 10, 12 weekly injections, and sometimes beyond that. But often these patients might need to be on these injections for the rest of their life. Now, at this stage, at the end of last year, some were certainly over injections given every single year for patients with diabetes. And this is growing year on year on. And it's a reflection of the growth of type 2 diabetes in our society. And it's quite simply not sustainable. It's costing something in the order of closer to $250 million just for the eye treatments. So I mentioned before that Evan Bruce was starting to see better. And what I've noticed in all of my patients who've engaged in a therapeutic reduction of their carbohydrate intake is almost immediately we're able to get them off their regular injections, or at least reduce the frequency of their regular injections. And I've also had some patients who presented to me with macular edema, who perhaps didn't quite need treatment with injections, but were getting close, who I also recommended seeing the nutritionist and engaging in therapeutic carbohydrate reduction. And there's one case which we're actually writing up at this very moment, has actually been accepted for publication. I think it's the first time it's ever been seen, was this middle-aged woman who, within 2 weeks, actually I think it was a week, she came off her insulin, and has since come off her medicines. And over a 9-month period, the macular edema resolved itself just with this change in diet, and her macula looks completely normal now. So it's a really exciting thing to be involved in. I'm talking about it with my colleagues to try and get them engaged. You mentioned before that it in essence, does ourselves out of a job. And that's ultimately what we want to do. We want to stop medicating patients, stop giving them these drugs. And if we can actually do it by using real food as medicine, then that's a much better approach, I believe. And loss of vision is, as I mentioned, the most feared complication, but there are many other complications of this disease, and most of which we're seeing improve with this therapeutic reduction of carbohydrate intake.
Yeah. It's certainly an exciting time. I got tired of this. My clients coming in to see me, and I'm just going, this is all preventable. This is all preventable. A lot of it's lack of education that it stems from. So, what you're doing and the movement that you're creating is certainly helping. And yeah, what amazing stories that are unfolding.
It's incredible. And I think one of the other things, sorry to interrupt, one of the other things I think is really critical, yes, it is preventable and is potentially reversible. We know that about 50% of patients who embark on therapeutic carbohydrate reduction will actually put their diabetes into remission. And that is now out to beyond 5 years in some trials. The problem being, okay, there's 50% who it doesn't seem to work in, and what are the reasonings for that? I think that needs to be uncovered. But we have a strong association between food addiction and type 2 diabetes. And we have an industry, the ultra-processed food industry, the sugary drinks industry, the fast food industry, who are preying on people's addictions. And there's lots of examples of that. You just go to the supermarket these days and you're enticed by half-price sugary drinks and chocolate at the checkout counter, have end of aisles, promotions, even in the fresh grocery section, you have chocolate stands. It's quite appalling, really. This predatory marketing by these industries is quite appalling. And also, there are examples. You go to the service station and you're filling your car with petrol, and there's an ad for half-price chocolates on the nozzle. You then go in to pay your fee and you're getting confronted by a wall of confectionery as you walk in the door. I mean, there's so many examples of this. It's not funny. I think this is one thing that needs to be held to account, and we're just not seeing our government do that at this stage. And this was another thing that I said to the government in the parliamentary inquiry into diabetes late last year. We have to stop this predatory behaviour of these industries. And another thing that I mentioned, one of the things that have often been touted, and in fact it works, is that a tax on sugary products. And there are many jurisdictions around the world where it does reduce purchase and reduce consumption of sugary products. But this is proven to be not palatable in our society. Neither of the major governments have taken it on. So I suggested then perhaps a more palatable approach would be to remove the tax breaks for marketing by these industries, which amounts to about $5 billion at least every year. And most of that money is going offshore. That money is coming out of the taxpayer's pocket and going offshore. And could you imagine what that $5 billion could be used for in fighting this scourge of type 2 diabetes?
That's a brilliant idea. Again, it's getting to that root cause, reverse engineering, and okay, what's causing this? Because, as you said, it's very hard for when people do have this diet. It's not easy to change, and we have to let people know that it's not really your fault. There's a lot of things at play that's making it very difficult for you. A lot of people are also under a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, and the time factor becomes into play, not being able to cook the meals and so forth. Yeah, it's certainly a very multifactorial thing that is going on.
Yeah, and it's not easy. Yes, I get it. Some people find it quite easy, but some people find it very difficult. But I tell you what, it's much easier than having monthly injections in both eyes for the rest of your life. It's much easier than having bits of your feet and legs chopped off for gangrene due to your type 2 diabetes. It's much easier than spending up to 6 hours a day, 4 days a week, hooked up to a dialysis machine. It's much easier than being faced with a dementia, as 70% of patients with type 2 diabetes will develop. And it's much easier than potential strokes and heart attacks that lay in wait for patients with type 2 diabetes, and the incredible expense that it's entailed as well.
Yeah, knowing your why usually is enough for people to be able to find that motivation and commitment, I guess, in their health and health and well-being. So another thing I was going to ask is that do you or have you started to see the eye degenerative in children coming through? Well, like we talk a lot about the adults, but are you starting to see that in children? And because again, all we need to do is look around, and yes, Australians are very metabolically unhealthy. The sad thing is that we're also seeing it amongst the children as well. So you're seeing that in your practice as well?
Yes. So when I was in medical school, type 2 diabetes was known as maturity onset diabetes, but we're now seeing it in kids in this country as young as 3 and 4. There are children with type 2 diabetes as young as 3 and 4 in this country. In fact, Northern Australia leads the world for type 2 diabetes in younger people. Now, it does take some time to develop the complications of type 2 diabetes. It takes, on average, once someone becomes insulin resistant, about 13 years in adults to develop type 2. In kids, it can happen within a couple of years. So it takes some time to develop the blinding or vision-threatening complications of type 2 diabetes. It has been reported in children. If we're talking about the WHO classification for children, it's under 16. So we have seen we have seen diabetic retinopathy in children. Personally, I haven't seen it, and I certainly haven't seen vision-threatening disease in young people, but it's certainly a risk, and it's being reported, but fortunately it's rare. But these kids are faced with a lifetime of devastation if they don't look to turn their metabolic dysfunction around. And type 2 diabetes is diagnosed when the HbA1c rises above 6.5. So it's an arbitrary cutoff. The metabolic dysfunction actually happens much earlier than that. And the risks that come along with it, particularly cardiovascular disease, we know that the risks for cardiovascular disease, for heart attacks, happen and start to increase after an HbA1c of 5. So I think what we need to be doing is not so much focusing on type 2 diabetes, but the metabolic dysfunction, which begins way back with insulin resistance and is actually affecting the majority of people in our community.
Do you know roughly what the percentage is of people that, let's just refer to Australia, that may have type 2 diabetes, or at least, and it goes insulin resistance, pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. How many of the population that might be wandering around blissfully unaware that they even have type 2 diabetes?
Yes, I think there's about 1.3, 1.4 million with type 2 diabetes in this country. So whatever that percentage is of 25 million. But there's another 600-700 plus who are undiagnosed. So that gives a level of about 2 million with type 2 diabetes. So there's at least 600,000-700,000 with type 2 diabetes who've not been diagnosed. So that's an opportunity to capture those patients, but also pre-diabetes and insulin resistance. You can say the majority of Australians will be insulin resistant. In America, there was a disturbing study a year or two ago which showed that 93% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. And I suspect we're not far behind. If we look at over 2/3 of Australians being overweight or obese, that means they are metabolically unhealthy. Unfortunately, there's this movement to say it's okay to be obese, but actually it's not 200 metabolically healthy. But, as I think I was alluding to before, obesity is the biggest risk factor for type 2 diabetes, but it's important. It's really important to remember that there are now more thin metabolically unhealthy people in the United States, and I suspect here in Australia, and many other countries, there are now more thin metabolically unhealthy people than there are obese metabolically unhealthy people. So obesity isn't the core issue here. It's not even the number of calories that people are taking. It's the type of calories, particularly the fructose and the seed oils, which are metabolic disruptors and are causing so much harm to our bodies. So we shouldn't be focusing on obesity. We shouldn't be normalizing obesity, but we've got to be careful not to shame people with obesity, but realize that the way that they've been taught to eat, this high carb, high cereal and grain, high fruit and veg dietary approach, is not what they need for their bodies.
Yeah, and I think when we're younger, in our 20s, and I mean, I look back when my early career of working shift work, oh my gosh, the food that I ate was absolute crap. It was terrible. But in saying that, though, some of those recommendations were to have a glass of orange juice and a piece of toast first thing in the morning on your cereal. We did that because that's what we thought we were doing and we thought we were being healthy. Fortunately for me, I worked it out pretty quickly that because my health started to go down quite quickly that I needed to do something straight away. And I went on my own journey. So that I knew that if I kept doing this and kept eating the food, not just orange juice and stuff, obviously all the other crap food that a lot of us shift workers tend to do for various different reasons, unless I stop doing something, I'm going to be down that path and possibly have developed type 2 diabetes today. But it's a very, very good point. When we look around, all you've got to do is walk around a shopping centre, and yes, we might be seeing these people that are overweight and so forth, but how many of those that are, as you say, toffee, thin on the outside, fat on the outside? Sorry,
thin on the outside, fat on the inside.
Fat on the inside. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. How many of those? Yeah, are actually
it's a big
not well. So we need to be
about 40% is the measure. And if you realise that the major ingredients of most ultra processed food, which make up 62% of the American diet, over 50% of the diet in the UK, and I suspect we're nudging close to 50% of our diet here, the major ingredients of most ultra processed foods are sugar, are refined carbohydrates, often in the form of wheat flour, and our seed oil. So this is a metabolic disruptor. It's like a loaded gun pointing at the levers, causing metabolic dysfunction. And unfortunately, as you know, it's these industries which are preying on the addictions, but it's also convenient food. It's become normalized. Whereas real food, natural food, such as red meat, such as natural saturated fats, such as butter, full-fat dairy, eggs, have become demonized. And there's lots of reasonings behind that. Yeah. I think if people realize that actually there's no evidence whatsoever to implicate red meat or natural saturated fat in cardiovascular disease and other diseases, then it's quite liberating, actually. And it is really the pathway we need to take to improve our metabolic health. Go back to eating real food, avoid this ultra-processed junk, will do us a lot of good in terms of preventing diabetes. And for your shift workers, often they're going to get something on the way home or on the way to work, often convenient ultra-processed food, but it's not doing them any help at all. What they should be doing is incorporating real food into their diets, and that will go a long way to preventing metabolic dysfunction, preventing pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And for patients with type 2 diabetes, I'd love to think that just by those approaches, added sugar, by avoiding sugary drinks, and by sugary drinks, I mean not just the soft drinks, but orange juice. A glass of orange juice has almost as much sugar as a glass of cola, for example. Avoiding energy drinks, all these health drinks, which are often packed with sugar, and avoiding sugary milks as well. So avoiding sugary drinks, avoiding foods. If you do that, you'll go a long way to reversing your metabolic dysfunction. But for people with type 2 diabetes, they may need to engage in a therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, as well as all of those other elements. And that involves reducing their carbs to less than 50 grams per day, what we call a ketogenic diet. Fortunately, I don't have type 2 diabetes. In fact, but if I had type 2 diabetes, I would engage in a ketogenic diet. I would see a ketogenic practitioner in my neighborhood, and fortunately there is a directory that the Low Carb Down Under group has put out, which shows state by state the low carb practitioners in your communities. So there's no doubt I would engage in that if I had type 2 diabetes. Back in 2020, I had an ultrasound of my abdomen because I had some pain in my lower back, and found out I had a fatty liver. And I looked at my diet leading up to 2020. It was pretty appalling, the amount of sugar. And as you note, the breakfast I had each morning was a glass or two of orange juice, 4 Weet-Bix smothered in sugar, or cornflakes smothered in Milo. I'd usually have a fruit yogurt and some fruit as well. And no wonder, by midday, I've crashed and I'm desperately needing some more sugar. So I had a fatty liver, and I went on this real food that basically removed all of those products as much as possible. It's not complete. I'm sort of low to medium carb most of the time, but I've been able to reverse that fatty liver and reverse my metabolic dysfunction, which was hopefully going to add a few years to my life and make my life actually much more, you think more clearly, you have more energy, sleep better. All of those things result by getting rid of these ultra-processed foods and shift work.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's even better for the shift workers that are battling that chronic fatigue and tiredness because of our crazy rosters that we do and so forth. But yeah, well, this has been such a great discussion, James, because I'm so excited to hear that the direction, particularly that's happening here in Australia, that we really are starting to address it, and a lot of that has to do with yourself and your fellow colleagues, and I'm certainly very appreciative of all of the work that you're doing. And so I guess if just to wind up the podcast, if there was, reflecting on your career thus far, if there were a couple of recommendations that you would say to your clients that you wish you'd known 30 years ago, what would you say to them to help them avoid coming in to see you, basically?
Yes, so we're talking about avoiding type 2 diabetes in the first place, or avoiding metabolic dysfunction in the first place.
Yeah.
Really, that comes back to the prevention we mentioned before.
And the impact of the eyes. Yeah.
If you can avoid end-stage metabolic dysfunction, which is type 2 diabetes, then you'll avoid all of the eye complications and all the other complications, of course, that I mentioned. But basically, it comes back to preventing metabolic dysfunction in the first place, which ultimately comes back to just eating real food. And by just eating real food, I would suggest avoiding those sugary drinks that I mentioned, avoiding foods cooked or deep fried in seed oils, avoiding ultra-processed foods, and avoiding refined carbohydrates. That is my message, that I think if we all did that, we'd be in a much better place.
Yeah. At the end of the day, we just want a healthy family to be able to have the energy, as you say, to be able to get up and do what we can, and avoid a lot of those terrible, as you were alluding to before, some of the terrible things later down the track that can eventuate when we develop type 2 diabetes. Yeah. So this has been such a great conversation, James. For anybody that may want to reach out to you, follow your work, what you're doing, what is the best point of contact for them?
I have LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram sites, Dr. James Muecke, Dr. James Muecke, Muecke. You should be able to find me on each of those. There's a few bogus Dr. James Muecke's around, but you'll see there's plenty of posts that you'll see, and it'll be pretty obvious when you're on the right side. But that's probably the best way. I was fortunate enough, as I mentioned, to win Australia of the Year back in 2020, which was not for my work in this area. It was actually for my work in fighting blindness. The co-founder called Sight for All. And so if people are interested in Sight for All and the work we're doing with Sight for All, which is all about fighting blindness, both locally in mainstream and Indigenous communities, and also internationally, where we're impacting on over 1 million people every year, Sight for All, SIGHTFOR.org, and we have a number of social media sites with Sight for All as well.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, I'll make sure all of that is included in the show notes. But again, thank you so very much for joining me, James. You're an absolute superhuman of a person, and it's such an honour to have this discussion with you. And I think it's amazing that the work that you have done previously and you continually to do for humanity.
It's very kind of you, Audra. Thank you for including me in your show. And I must acknowledge all of my colleagues and mentors who've guided me through this process. It's not just me, but I certainly have an army behind me, and it's been very humbling to be involved in this process and to have the impact that we're having. So it's a thrill. It's probably one of the best things I've achieved in my life beyond my family. It's been absolutely fantastic. So thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, you're certainly leaving a wonderful legacy, that's for sure. But all right. Well, that's it for today's podcast. Thank you so very much for joining me. If you found this interesting or insightful, please spread this podcast here and wide, as it enables me to be able to spread this message to more and more shift workers, both here in Australia and around the world.